Good evening and welcome back. Wherever you are right now, whether you're sitting by a lamp that's been on too long, lying in the dark with one earbud in, or driving somewhere that feels far from everything familiar, I'm glad you're here. Drop a comment or a message or whatever the medium allows, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. It matters. It always has. Tonight we're going long. Tonight we go all the way back, further than Rome, further than Alexander, further even than the name Greece meant anything at all. Tonight we begin before the beginning. Because what became the Greek Empire? What became the civilization that infected the entire Western world like a beautiful fever did not start with generals or gold. It started with mud and myth and the slow, violent accumulation of human meaning in a landscape that seemed designed to resist it. The peninsula was not generous. The mountains were close together. The soil was thin. The sea was everywhere, and it was never safe. The people who came there, wave after wave of them, probably had no sense that they were building the mother of all Western thought. They were hungry. They were cold. Some of them were running from something. All of them were trying to survive. And from survival, somehow, through a process that is genuinely difficult to describe, they built everything. Let me try to tell you how. In the beginning, the Greeks said, there was chaos, but the word they used did not mean disorder in the way we mean it now. It meant something closer to a gap, a yawning open space, an absence that somehow managed to be present. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE and collecting something much older than himself, described the universe's first state as this void. Not emptiness exactly, but potentiality without form. The darkness before the first exhalation. There is an ache in that image that resists easy interpretation. From chaos came Gaia, the deep-breasted earth, and Tartarus, the shadowed pit below even the earth, and Eros, not the mischievous boy with arrows that later poets would make him, but something older and more terrifying, the force that compels things toward one another, the first principle of combination. And from chaos also came Erebus, the darkness, and Nyx, the night. And then Nyx, alone or perhaps with Erebus beside her, produced Hemera, the day, and Ether, the bright upper air. Notice what this cosmogony is doing. It is not telling you that a god made the world. It is telling you that the world made itself, that consciousness and matter and the organizing principle of desire are coeval, that they arose together out of the same primordial condition. This is either very primitive or very sophisticated, depending on where you stand, and I would argue it is both simultaneously. Gaia, solid beneath everything, produced Uranos, the sky, the vault of heaven, and he arched over her, and they became the first couple. From this pairing came the first generations of beings, the Titans, 12 of them, vast and powerful as geological epochs, slow to anger but devastating when moved. Among them, Oceanus, who was the great encircling river of the world, Hyperion, who carried the sun, Themis, who was the deep grain of natural law, and Kronos, the youngest and most dangerous, who already carried within him the shadow of what he would become. Ouranos, it must be said, was a terrible father. He was afraid. When Gaia bore him other children, the Cyclopes, each with their single eye Gaia burning like a forge, and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants, whose strength was incomprehensible even among divine beings, he looked at them and saw threat rather than continuation, power rather than inheritance. He pushed them back into Gaia's body, back into the earth, buried alive in the mother who had made them. Gaia suffered this. For a time she suffered it. Then she did not. She fashioned a great adamantine sickle, the first tool of political violence in the history of the cosmos, and she went to her Titan children, and she asked which of them would do what needed to be done. 11 of them looked away. Kronos took the sickle. The account of what followed is stark in the ancient sources, and deliberately, ritually strange. Ouranos came to lie with Gaia in the darkness, as he always did, spreading himself over her, and Kronos reached out from where he was hidden and severed his father's genitals and cast them into the sea. The sky and the earth were separated. Ouranos, unmanned and in agony, cursed his son with the force of a dying prophecy. You will be overthrown as you have overthrown me. Your children will take what you have taken. From the blood that fell on the earth grew the Furies and the giants and the nymphs of ash trees. From the severed flesh that fell into the sea there formed, around it, a white foam, and from that foam rose Aphrodite, laughter-loving, sea-born, carrying with her the foam and the sea salt, and something of the wound that had made her possible. Kronos ruled then. The Titans spread across the world, and it was, by all accounts in all the stories, a good time to be alive. The first age, the age of gold, when Hesiod says humanity, and this is where humans begin to appear in the telling, tentatively, almost parenthetically, as if they're not quite sure they belong in the story yet, lived like gods, without toil or sorrow, feasting on the fruit the earth gave freely, dying at last as if falling asleep. No iron, no war, no winter of the soul. But Kronos had heard his father's curse. He had understood it. He took Rhea as his consort, and when she bore him children, he swallowed them. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, one by one, down into the darkness of his own belly, imprisoned in their father, as surely as the Cyclopes had been imprisoned in the earth. He was not evil, perhaps. He was afraid, and the ancient Greeks understood very clearly that fear unchecked produces the thing it is most terrified of. Rhea could not stop him. She had borne the loss of 5 children into the dark of her husband. When she was pregnant with the 6th, she went to her own mother, Gaia, and asked what could be done. Gaia told her. She gave birth to Zeus on the island of Crete, in a cave on a mountain, and she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Kronos, who swallowed it without looking closely enough. The infant god was hidden. He was raised by nymphs and fed on honey and goat's milk and the clean mountain air, and somewhere in that hidden childhood, the shape of the future was being determined. It is worth dwelling here a moment, because this pattern the divine child hidden from a threatened patriarch, the secret upbringing, the return for reckoning, is not merely Greek. It appears in too many cultures, across too wide a geography, to be coincidence. And what it keeps saying, underneath the local variations, is this: power devours its children, but one child survives the devouring, and that child comes back. There is something in human consciousness that needs this story. It needs to believe that what is swallowed is not destroyed, that it waits. Zeus grew, and when he was grown, with Gaia's counsel and Metis's craft, Metis being the titaness of cunning thought, whom Zeus eventually took as his first consort in the political, rather than merely romantic sense. He gave Kronos an emetic, and Kronos vomited up his children, first the stone, then Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, then Hestia, each of them as whole and powerful as if no time had passed, because for gods, inside the dark of their father's belly, perhaps no time had. The Olympians gathered. The war began. The Titanomachy, the war of the gods against the Titans, lasted, by the accounts, 10 years. 10 years of divine warfare, which is so long a span that it suggests not a single battle, but an epoch of struggle, a protracted negotiation between one order and another. Zeus freed the Cyclopes, who in gratitude forged for him his thunderbolts, weapons of such destructive precision that they would define his identity for all of subsequent tradition. Poseidon received his trident. Hades received the helmet of invisibility, which says something interesting about the nature of death, that its lord goes unseen. The Titans were formidable. Kronos had ruled an age. His siblings were old and vast, in the way that mountains are old and vast. But the Olympians had what the Titans had never possessed, a new kind of intelligence, a willingness to ally laterally rather than dominate vertically, and, not incidentally, the violence of those who have been wronged. They fought with the fury of the swallowed who have been disgorged, the fury of those who were nearly nothing and chose to be something. The hecatoncheires, those 100-handed ones whom Uranos had first imprisoned and Kronos had kept imprisoned, were freed by Zeus and joined the Olympians' side. They hurled 300 boulders at once. The earth shook, the sea seethed, even Tartarus itself was lit by the lightning. And at last the Titans broke and fell and were themselves cast into Tartarus, deep beneath even the earth they had ruled, guarded now by the hecatoncheires in the prison they had themselves once kept. But there is a detail here that the myths insist upon, and I want to stay with it longer than most tellings do, because it matters for everything that comes after. Not all the Titans were imprisoned. Some had not fought. Prometheus had sided with Zeus. Themis was the mother of certain fates. Oceanus had stayed out of the war entirely, flowing on around the edges of the world as he always had. The victory of the Olympians was not total. It was a renegotiation rather than an erasure. The old order was suppressed but not destroyed. It persisted, as old orders tend to, in the substrate beneath the new. And then came the question of what to do with what had been won. The world divided, the lots drawn. Zeus took the sky, the high places, the breath of storms and the burning precision of lightning. Poseidon took the sea, the roiling middle realm, the surface that connects all shores. Hades took what was beneath, the kingdom of the dead, the final territory, the place where everything eventually arrives. The earth itself, Gaia, remained common ground, neither possessed nor fully shared, available to all and belonging fully to none. This division was not merely administrative, it was ontological. It described the structure of existence itself, above, below, between, sky, earth, sea, the three registers in which mortal life moves, each presided over by a different kind of divine attention. Hera became queen of Olympus and wife to Zeus, though the myths are quietly insistent that the relationship between them was never simple or peaceful. She had been swallowed and disgorged. She was a queen who had arrived at her throne through the gut of a tyrant. That she was furious, often, was not irrational. That Zeus was serially unfaithful was not incidental. The marriage of Zeus and Hera is the great fractured central institution of the Olympian order, and every crack in it produces a story, which may be why the Greeks told so many. Athena came from Zeus's own head, which requires a prior story. Zeus, having received the prophecy that Metis's child would surpass its father as he had surpassed Kronos, swallowed Metis entire. Her wisdom, he thought, would be his. Instead, Metis worked from within, fashioning armor and a helmet, and the hammering drove Zeus to such pain that he called Hephaestus to split his skull open, and from the split emerged Athena, fully formed and fully armed, a goddess of war and wisdom who owed nothing to any mother anyone could name. She was the ultimate patriarchal creation myth, a woman born from a man, skipping the feminine entirely. The Greeks, to their credit, seem to have found this slightly ridiculous as well as sublime. Artemis and Apollo came from Leto, persecuted by Hera's jealousy, wandering from island to island until at last Delos, the floating island, gave her refuge. They were twins, she of the hunt and the moon and sudden death, he of the sun and prophecy and the terrifying beauty of form made perfect. Between them they covered most of what it meant to be alive in the body and most of what it meant to see with the mind. Hermes was born in a cave and stole Apollo's cattle before he was a day old, inventing the lyre on the way as if to have an alibi that was also a gift. Ares was born of Hera and Zeus and was a source of constant embarrassment to them both. The god of war, understood as pure, irrational bloodlust, the battle joy that has no strategic intelligence behind it, which is perhaps why the Greeks lost so many battles they should have won and won so many they had no right to. Hephaestus was thrown from Olympus, by Zeus in one version, by Hera in another, who found him too ugly, though what an Olympian goddess understood as ugly the mind hesitates to imagine, and landed in the sea and was lamed and limped ever after on feet that had been broken by the fall, and became nonetheless the greatest craftsman the universe had ever seen. The order was established. It was complex and contradictory and alive with its own internal conflicts. The Olympians were not a unified council of benign administrators. They were a family, which is to say a collection of people bound by blood and proximity into something that was sometimes cooperative and sometimes catastrophic, who had to share a home and a function and a history that included tremendous violence and resentment. The world below them proceeded. I need to pause here, actually. There's a thread I've been carrying since the beginning that I want to make sure I haven't dropped. The question of where humans come from in all of this, and what that origin means for everything that happens later. Because the Greek myths are not primarily about the gods. The gods are the backdrop. The gods are the weather. Humans are the subject. Some versions say Prometheus made the first humans from clay, which would make him simultaneously their creator and their champion, and eventually their sacrifice. Others say humans were made by the gods collectively, or emerged from the earth, or existed always in some undifferentiated form and were shaped into something distinct by the forces pressing on them. Hesiod does not resolve this cleanly. What he does say clearly is that there was a moment, and this moment is the wound at the center of everything, when the relationship between humans and gods was severed, and that Prometheus was at the center of it. The gathering at Macedon, they called it, gods and humans meeting for the first time to negotiate the terms of sacrifice, the ritual sharing of meat that defined the boundary between the divine and the mortal. Prometheus divided an ox. On one side, the meat and organs, the nutritious parts, wrapped in the stomach lining and hidden beneath a rough exterior. On the other side, the bones wrapped in gleaming fat, beautiful to look at, nearly worthless to eat. He offered Zeus the choice. Zeus chose the bones. Or, some say, he saw through the trick and chose the bones anyway, already angry, already planning. The result was the same. Humans would eat the meat. Gods would receive the bones and fat burned on altars, and the smoke would rise to heaven, smelling of offering, but carrying nothing of sustenance. The deal was made, and then Zeus, in punishment, or perhaps in the fulfillment of a plan already formed, withdrew fire from humanity. He would let them have their meat, but they would eat it raw. They would have their bodies, but they would freeze. Prometheus went to Olympus and stole fire from the forge of Hephaestus, or from the chariot of the sun, depending on who tells it. He brought it back to humans in a hollow fennel stalk, the thermal insulation that kept the coal alive. This was the second theft of fire in Greek mythology. The first was when the gods themselves organized existence against the formless dark. The second was when a single titan, alone, decided that what the gods had decided was wrong. Zeus chained Prometheus to a rock in the Caucasus. Every day an eagle, some say it was Zeus himself in the form of an eagle, which is a disturbing image the Greeks seem to have deployed quite deliberately, came and ate his liver. Every night the liver grew back. Every morning the eagle returned. This was not punishment in the sense of correction. It was punishment in the sense of demonstration. This is what happens when a will sets itself against the will of the absolute ruler. The body becomes the message. The regenerating liver is the most exquisite detail. The torture cannot be concluded, cannot be survived, cannot be ended except by outside intervention. It is eternal, but it is not abstract. It is renewed daily. It hurts every time, as if for the first time. Heracles would eventually free him, but that is a story for another time, and the freedom, when it came, was not without its own conditions. Pandora came next. Zeus, still angry, or perhaps Zeus implementing a plan that preceded his anger, which would mean the anger was theatrical, which would be worse, gave Epimetheus, Prometheus's less careful brother, a woman formed from clay by Hephaestus, animated by Athena, adorned by all the gods, given a name that meant all gifted. He gave her also a great jar, which later translations would call a box. He told her not to open it. He must have known she would. What came out of the jar? Every sickness, every grief, every form of suffering that had not previously existed in the world. They scattered. They became permanent. They became the texture of mortal life. At the bottom of the jar, when everything else had escaped, one thing remained: Elpis, hope, which the myth doesn't tell you is the antidote, but which also doesn't tell you is the curse. Because hope, the expectation of futures that may not arrive, is the one specifically human torment that Pandora's jar introduced, along with everything else. Or it was the one mercy that the cruelty of the gods still couldn't bring themselves to remove. The ambiguity is the point. Hesiod describes 5 ages of human history, and the structure of this sequence is important not just mythologically, but historically, because it is one of the first frameworks in any tradition for understanding the relationship between time and decline. The Age of Gold, humans lived under Kronos, easy, full, dying without sorrow. The Age of Silver, humans less noble, slower to grow, more stubborn, disrespectful to the gods, destroyed at last by Zeus. The Age of Bronze, violent, iron-hearted, self-destroying in war. Then something strange, the Age of Heroes, inserted between the bronze and what came next, as if Hesiod could not bear to place his beloved warriors in a continuous descent, needed to give them a brief ascent before the final fall. The Trojan heroes, the Theban heroes, the great laboring figures of myth, they went, when they died, to the Isles of the Blessed, which was not Elysium, and was not Tartarus, and was not the ordinary grey underworld, but something else, a sidestep out of the decline narrative, a place where the great ones rest, outside the logic of erosion. And then the Age of Iron, which was Hesiod's age, which is, he says, our age, in which hard work does not guarantee reward, and the gods feel distant, and humans are capable of anything, good and terrible alike, in which justice is administered and also bought, in which the fates still spin and cut, but no one can quite see the thread. There is something nearly unbearable about a writer sitting in the 8th century BCE and saying, "We have already lost the best of it. We are in the worst age," and then continuing to write anyway. This is what the Greeks did with their myths about decline. They told the stories of the Golden and Silver and Bronze Ages, not in order to despair, but in order to know where they were standing. Loss named is loss understood. Loss understood is, at minimum, loss confronted. They were not optimists, but they kept going. Let me tell you now about the heroes, the great ones, the figures that the Greek world produced and then could not stop talking about, whose names never stopped accumulating new stories, the way rivers accumulate silt. Not because the stories were literally true, but because they were so true in another sense that they became more real over time rather than less. Heracles, or Hercules, as Rome would make him and the world would keep him, was born with a target on his back that had been painted there before his birth. His mother was Alcmene, a mortal woman of great dignity and greater beauty, and Zeus desired her and came to her in the form of her husband Amphitryon, which is a detail the myths present with a discomfort that they don't quite know how to process, and so mostly don't try. Heracles was the son of a deception. He was born already implicated. Hera hated him with the focused, sustained, almost professional hatred of a goddess who had been insulted in the deepest possible way. She sent 2 serpents into his cradle when he was still an infant, and the infant strangled them both, which is either a miracle or a horror or both, and the myth presents it as both. Because what kind of child strangles serpents in their cradle? What does that tell you about the burden they will carry? He was educated by centaurs, Chiron principally, that ancient figure who appears at the origin of so many heroes' stories that he seems less a character than an institution, less a teacher than a principle of education itself. From Chiron, Heracles learned. There is argument about this. The ancient sources are not consistent. The arts of medicine and music and prophecy, the violence he seems to have arrived with. He killed his first teacher in a fit of anger. He was strong beyond measuring, and the strength was not under his control in the way that strength ideally should be. He was not a stable man. He was a great man, which the Greeks understood as a related but distinct category. The 12 labors are the part everyone knows, but what the summary versions leave out is that the labors were a punishment. He had killed his own wife and children in a madness sent by Hera. The details are painful, and the ancient sources are, in some places, clearly uncomfortable recording them, and the oracle at Delphi told him that to purify himself, he must serve King Eurystheus for 12 years and perform whatever tasks the king demanded. So the labors were not a hero choosing great deeds. They were a man in penance, assigned impossible tasks by a coward hiding in a bronze jar, because Eurystheus, when he met Heracles, was afraid of him and would give his orders through a herald, and would hide in the jar when Heracles returned with the trophies of his victories. The Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, the Erymanthian boar, the Aegean stables, the Stymphalian birds, the Cretan bull, the mares of Diomedes, the girdle of Hippolyta, the cattle of Geryon, the apples of the Hesperides, Cerberus himself, dragged from the underworld, and the others. Each one was supposed to be the last one. Eurystheus kept invalidating the ones he didn't like, kept adding to the list, kept moving the goal. Heracles kept completing them. He descended into the underworld and returned. He went to the ends of the earth and returned. He held up the sky while Atlas fetched the apples. And then, this is the stroke of cleverness that the myths keep giving Heracles, when everyone expects only brute force. He persuaded Atlas to take the sky back by asking him to hold it for just a moment while Heracles adjusted his cloak. He died on a pyre of his own making. His wife Deianira, deceived by the centaur Nessus, gave him a cloak soaked in what she thought was a love potion and was in fact a poison, and the agony of it was such that he gathered wood himself and built his own funeral pyre and lay down on it and asked a passing traveler to light it. The fire took him, and then, the myth insists on this, something rose from the flames, something that was not the man but was more than he had been, and went to Olympus and was received. He became a god. He married Hebe, goddess of youth, eternal and at peace. The transformation is important. The hero who carried so much suffering, who committed so much violence, who was born into a curse, not of his making, and never fully escaped it, he arrived somewhere, not at peace exactly, not redeemed exactly, but somewhere past the ending that seemed inevitable. Perseus was different in almost every way, but the structure of his beginning rhymes with the structure of Heracles' beginning, and this is worth sitting with. He too was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman. He too was the target of a king's paranoia before he was even born. His grandfather, Acrisius, received a prophecy that his daughter's son would kill him, and so Acrisius locked his daughter Danae in a bronze chamber, which is such a human response to fate, to put the future behind bars, to try to prevent by architecture what the gods have decreed. And Zeus came to her as a shower of golden rain, and Perseus was born, and Acrisius, rather than killing his daughter and grandchild directly, which would have been impious, had them sealed in a wooden chest and cast into the sea. The sea brought them to the island of Seriphos. Dictys, a fisherman, a kind man, in a story that doesn't have many kind men, found them and sheltered them. Perseus grew, and when Polydectes, the king of Seriphos, and not a kind man at all, decided he wanted Danae and found Perseus inconvenient, he sent the young man on an errand designed to be a death sentence. Bring me the head of the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze turned men to stone. What Perseus needed, he received from unlikely sources. Athena gave him direction. Hermes gave him a curved sword. He found the Graeae, the Grey Women, 3 sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth, the last relics of some even older order, and he stole their eye as they passed it between them and held it for ransom until they told him where to find the Hesperides, who gave him a kibisis, a bag for carrying the head, and winged sandals, and the helmet of invisibility that Hades had once worn. He came to where Medusa slept among her dead, the petrified figures of men who had looked directly at her, arranged around her like a terrible garden. Perseus did not look directly at her. He used his polished shield as a mirror, and approached backward and cut her head from her body while she slept, and shoved it in the bag, and put on the helmet, and flew away invisible, while her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, who were immortal and could not be killed, raged below him unable to find him. From Medusa's severed neck, incidentally, sprang Pegasus and Chrysaor, which is another of those moments where the myth offers you something strange and beautiful, and declining to explain, just presents it and moves on. The horse with wings, born from the neck of a monster. The sword that can kill the things that cannot be killed, born from the same moment. Perseus carried the head back. He met Andromeda on the way, chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster sent against her mother's people because her mother had boasted of beauty surpassing the Nereids, which is almost a comedy of escalation, except for the part where someone was chained to a rock above the sea. He killed the monster. He married Andromeda. He returned to Seriphos and turned Polydectes and his followers to stone by producing the head at the feast. He gave the head to Athena, who placed it on her shield forever, which is why Athena's shield bears the face of Medusa, the weapon of defense made from the weapon of death. He went back to Argos, the kingdom he had never known. His grandfather Acrisius, hearing he was coming and still afraid of the prophecy, fled. They met at funeral games in another city by accident, and Perseus threw a discus badly, and it curved on the wind and struck an old man in the crowd. The old man was Acrisius. The prophecy had never been about intention. It had never been avoidable. Perseus had tried to prevent it. He was devastated. He refused to take the kingdom his grandfather had ruled because the murder, even accidental, made it impossible to live there. He went elsewhere. He founded Mycenae, some say, the great golden city, the Bronze Age kingdom that would send its king to fight at Troy. And so even Perseus's victory came with its shadow. Let me linger a little longer than usual on the figure of Achilles, because he is the one the Greeks could not stop returning to, the one who feels most transparently like a cultural obsession, like someone a civilization dreamed about so intensely that the dream shaped the waking world. His mother was Thetis, a sea nymph, a Nereid, and the myths differ on whether she was married to Peleus because she wanted to be, or because the gods forced the union upon her to prevent the fulfillment of a prophecy. She was destined to bear a son greater than his father, and if that father was Zeus or Poseidon, the implications were structurally identical to Kronos and Zeus, which no Olympian could permit. So she was given to a mortal man. She gave up the sea for him, the immortality for him, and some versions suggest she never forgave it. Not him precisely, but the situation, the subordination. There is a grief built into Achilles before he is born. She tried to make him invulnerable. The stories differ here too. Some say she dipped him in the Styx, holding him by the heel. Some say she was burning away his mortality in fire, night by night, until Peleus caught her and she fled, and the process was interrupted. What is agreed upon is that Achilles emerged with one point of vulnerability that his mother's protection could not reach: the heel. The place where she held him, the place her fingers covered. He was educated by Chiron, as Heracles had been, which places him in that lineage of heroes formed outside ordinary society, in the wilderness, in the care of the half-animal wise man who exists precisely to produce the kinds of humans that ordinary society does not produce, and cannot quite contain. He had a friend, Patroclus, and the nature of that friendship the Greek texts treat with an intimacy and an intensity that later ages would sometimes sanitize and sometimes overinterpret, but the texts themselves are simply there, presenting a love, whether erotic or not is beside the point, so total that Achilles' entire life after Patroclus' death is shaped by it, by grief, by the need to avenge, by the transformation that grief performs on even the most formidable of men. There was a prophecy. Achilles could live a long life, unremarkable, without glory, at home, or he could go to Troy and die young and be remembered forever. He went to Troy. This was not a difficult choice for Achilles. The myth does not pretend it was. What was difficult, what the Iliad is actually about, is what happened after he arrived. He quarreled with Agamemnon. The quarrel was about a slave woman, which sounds in summary small and venal, but it was actually about the nature of honor in a warrior culture, about whether the greatest warrior could be publicly humiliated by the greatest king and simply accept it, about whether the social hierarchy of command superseded the personal hierarchy of merit. Achilles withdrew from the war. The Greeks suffered without him. He watched them suffer and remained in his tent, and the watching cost him something, but he stayed. Then Patroclus borrowed his armor and led the Myrmidons into battle, and was killed by Hector, prince of Troy, son of Priam, the greatest warrior on the other side. And then Achilles re-entered the war, and the Iliad's account of what followed is among the most devastating passages in all of world literature. Achilles killing everything in his path, the river Scamander rising against him and nearly swallowing him because it was choked with the bodies he had put in it. Achilles driving Hector around the walls of Troy 3 times before the battle. Achilles killing Hector and refusing to return the body, dragging it through the dust behind his chariot every morning for days, while Priam watched from the walls. Then old Priam came to him at night, alone, slipping through the Greek camp with a ransom to beg for his son's body. And Achilles, who had been a weapon with a human face since Patroclus died, sat with this old man who was his enemy's father, and shared food with him, and wept with him, and gave back the body. This is what the Greeks thought a hero could be, capable of inhuman violence, and also, in the same skin, capable of inhuman compassion. Not one or the other, both simultaneously at the cost of enormous suffering. Achilles died not long after, shot by Paris, beautiful, irresponsible Paris, whose desire had started the war, who was guided in his shot by Apollo, the arrow finding the one point the sea could not protect. He died outside the walls of Troy that never fell to him. He was 19, some say. He had chosen this. He had known he was choosing it. The choice is the thing the myths keep insisting on, not the death itself, but the choosing. Odysseus is the 4th of the great ones I want to spend time with, and he requires the most careful treatment because he is the least straightforwardly admirable, and therefore, probably, the most interesting. He was not beautiful in the heroic mold. He was broad-shouldered and strong, but not imposing at a glance. He was the king of a small, rough island that no one would have thought important. His grandfather, on his mother's side, was Autolycus, who was the greatest thief in the world and the son of Hermes, which explains something about the inheritance. He was the cleverest man in the Greek world, and he used his cleverness in ways that were pragmatic rather than honorable, in ways that won him enemies among the gods and among men alike, and in ways that also, when it mattered most, saved every life that was saved. It was his idea to build the wooden horse. This is either the greatest tactical innovation in ancient warfare or the greatest trick ever played, depending on how you feel about tricks. The Greeks had besieged Troy for 10 years. They were not winning by force. Odysseus understood what brute force could not accomplish and proposed what intelligence could. The horse stood before the walls of Troy. The Greeks sailed away, visibly, plausibly, leaving only one man behind, Sinon, whose job was to be captured and believed. He told the Trojans that the horse was an offering to Athena, that it had been built too large to fit through the gates deliberately, because Calchas the prophet had said that if the Trojans ever brought it inside their walls, they would be invincible. The Trojans debated. Cassandra, Priam's daughter, who had the gift of true prophecy and the curse of never being believed, said the horse would destroy them. A priest named Laocoon hurled a spear at it and said it was a trick. The gods sent sea serpents to kill Laocoon and his sons, which the Trojans took as a sign from heaven that the horse was sacred. They pulled it inside. In the night, the Greeks who had hidden inside it came out. They opened the gates. The fleet came back. Troy burned. Odysseus's return from Troy took 10 years more, which is the subject of the Odyssey, and too large to summarize without diminishing it. What matters structurally is that he was punished by Poseidon, because his crew had blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was Poseidon's son, and Odysseus had announced his name in triumph, which was both prideful and fatal, and that his punishment was the denial of return. Every time he came close to home, the sea pushed him away. He lost every ship he had. He lost every man he had. He arrived home alone, after 10 years, in disguise, to find his house full of men who were eating his food and courting his wife, and were certain he was dead. He killed them all, with his bow, which no one else could string, and with his son Telemachus's help, and with the disguised Athena at his side. He killed every one of them. Then he met his wife Penelope, who had waited 20 years and had spent them unweaving at night what she wove each day as a delay, telling the suitors she would choose when the shroud she was weaving for her father-in-law was complete, and who even then, even when her husband stood before her, identified, alive, tested him, because she was Penelope and she had waited 20 years and she was not going to stop being careful now. He told her how their bed was made. He had built it himself around a living olive tree so that it could not be moved. No one else knew that. She wept and came to him, and the homecoming that had been denied for 20 years was finally real. But the myths say, quietly, in the aftermath, that Odysseus did not stay, that a prophecy of his own demanded he carry an oar inland until he found people who did not know what it was, and plant it there, and only then could he die at peace. He always had one more journey. He was always, in some fundamental way, still going. Anyway, the war at Troy was the thing the Greeks kept returning to, not merely as myth, but as cultural memory, as the place where the heroic age ended and the Iron Age truly began. It was not one story, but a cycle, the Trojan cycle, and the individual Iliads and Odysseys and Aeneads and tragedies that drew from it are too numerous to catalogue. What the cycle amounts to, when you look at it whole, is a story about what happens when the greatest people in the world are assembled in one place for one purpose, and what that purpose costs them. Troy was a real city. We know this now. The excavations at Hisarlik have established that much. Whether the war was real, whether Helen was real, whether Achilles was real, these questions are differently answerable, and the answer to each of them probably involves the word possibly, deployed with appropriate tentativeness. What was real was the memory. What was real was the cultural weight of the story. The Greeks of the classical period, Herodotus, Thucydides, the tragedians, the comedians, treated the Trojan War as the anchor event of their historical consciousness. It was the edge where history and myth blurred in a productive rather than a confusing way. Paris had taken Helen because Aphrodite had promised her to him as the prize for judging a beauty contest between three goddesses, which raises the question of what kind of cosmos places the fate of cities and thousands of lives in the hands of a vain young man's aesthetic preferences. And the answer the Greeks seem to give is exactly this kind: that the gods' competitions and jealousies produce human catastrophe is not an accident of the mythology. It is the point of it. Agamemnon, leading the expedition, had to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to get favorable winds from Artemis. The goddess was angry. There are varying accounts of why, but the demand was made, and Agamemnon made the choice. And Clytemnestra, his wife, watched her daughter die and waited 10 years. Through the war and the waiting and the silence, she waited. When Agamemnon returned victorious, with Cassandra as his war prize, Clytemnestra killed them both in the bath. Her son Orestes, grown by then, killed her in turn, was instructed to by Apollo and required to by the logic of blood vengeance. Then the Furies, those beings born from the blood of the castrated Uranos, the oldest principle of retributive justice, pursued Orestes across the world for the crime of matricide. The great Athenian playwright Aeschylus set the resolution of this cycle at Athens, before the court of the Areopagus, with Athena herself presiding, and the vote came out tied, and Athena cast the deciding vote for Orestes, for release, for the new principle of law over the old principle of blood. The Furies became the Eumenides, the kindly ones, dwelling beneath Athens in their cave, transformed from agents of the old retributive order into something like the city's protective conscience. The myth of Orestes is the myth of Greece itself, the question of whether the new order of justice can supersede the ancient order of vengeance. The answer Athens gave was yes, barely, by a single vote, by the goddess of the city casting her personal decision, by the narrowest possible margin. It is not a triumphant yes. It is a conditional yes. It is a yes that knows what it displaced and is not entirely comfortable with the displacement. Let me collect the thread. The collective catastrophe at Troy, the 10 years of war, the burning, the diaspora of survivors, produced, paradoxically, the conditions for what came next. The kingdoms of the Mycenaean age collapsed in the century or so following the traditional date for Troy, in a series of destructions that archaeology has confirmed but not fully explained. Drought, earthquake, invasion, trade collapse, internal rebellion, probably all of these operating together in the kind of systemic failure that happens when the margins disappear from every system simultaneously. The great palaces fell. The writing system of the Mycenaean world, Linear B, was lost. For several generations, the Greeks were, effectively, illiterate. This is the Dark Age, the period from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, about which we know very little. The period from which almost nothing survived. And yet what was remembered, what was kept alive in oral form, in the mouths of poets who were trained to remember and trained to perform, included the material that would become the Iliad and the Odyssey. The greatest flowering of Greek literary production occurred on the other side of a collapse that should have destroyed the cultural memory that made it possible. It did not destroy it. The oral tradition held it in the dark for 300 years, and then writing came back. Not Linear B, but the Phoenician alphabet, adapted and improved. And the first thing the Greeks wrote down was Homer. The city-states emerged from the Dark Age, like plants from cracked concrete, each one different, each one shaped by its particular geography and trade position and historical accident. None of them unified, most of them in some form of productive or destructive competition with the others. Athens and Sparta are the ones we know best, but they were not the only ones. Corinth was rich, Thebes was powerful, Argos was ancient. The Greek world stretched from the coast of Asia Minor to the shores of Sicily and the Black Sea, and every colony was another experiment in what it meant to be Greek in a place that had never been Greek before. Athens grew from its Mycenaean past into something genuinely new, a city that moved, fitfully and violently and with tremendous reversals, toward a form of self-governance that had not been attempted anywhere before. This is not the place to describe Athenian democracy in all its complexity, but its mythological dimension matters here. The Athenians understood themselves as divinely favored by Athena, their city as the gift of wisdom to the world, their governance as a human instantiation of the divine order that had been established on Olympus. They were not humble about this. The hubris of Athens, its confidence in its own centrality, its conviction that the Greek world revolved around it, was both its greatest strength and the thing that eventually destroyed it. Sparta grew differently, down the other valley, toward a social order that valued the collective over the individual, the body over the mind, obedience over innovation. The myths Sparta told about itself were different myths. Lycurgus, the lawgiver, the secret training, the exposed infants, the iron currency. Their relationship to the divine was transactional rather than philosophical. They were not producing tragedies. They were producing soldiers, and they were very good at it. The Persian Wars, in the early 5th century BCE, gave the Greek cities a common enemy and, briefly, something like common purpose, Marathon, where the Athenians and Plataeans alone held against a Persian force and then ran, literally ran, the 25 miles back to Athens to prevent a naval landing. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies held the pass long enough for the fleet to organize, at the cost of every life. Salamis, where the Athenian navy destroyed the Persian fleet in the narrow channel, and Xerxes watched from his golden throne on the hill and saw his ships burn. Plataea, the following year, where the Persian land forces were finally broken. The Greeks who survived these wars had a story to tell, that they had held, that the small, quarreling, difficult civilization of city-states had stood against the largest empire the world had yet produced, and had not broken. This story shaped everything that came after. It gave the classical period its particular confidence, its sense that the Greek way of debate, of art, of philosophy had proven itself against an alternative. It also made the Greeks harder to unite than they might otherwise have been, because everyone remembered their own role in the victory, and no one was willing to accept someone else's leadership of the peace. The Peloponnesian War, Athens against Sparta, from 431 to 404 BCE, with almost every city in the Greek world drawn in eventually, was the great self-destruction. Thucydides, who witnessed it, wrote about it with a clarity and a sadness that reads like a man watching a fire he predicted and was unable to prevent. Athens lost, Sparta won, and then couldn't manage what it had won. Thebes rose briefly. Alexander's father Philip came down from Macedonia, which the Greeks had always considered semi-barbarous, and which had been watching and learning, and absorbed the weakened city-states into his orbit. There is something here. I'm not entirely sure it belongs at this point in the telling, but I'm leaving it in. Something here that feels like recognition when you look at it from far enough away. The pattern of the myths had always been the son who surpasses the father, the new generation that overthrows the old, the eternal return of the same struggle in new forms. Philip was surpassed by Alexander. Alexander was a better version of everything Philip had built, and Philip had built it knowing that would be the outcome. There is either profound wisdom or profound melancholy in that, and probably both. Alexander III of Macedon, called the Great by tradition and perhaps by his own eventual preference, was born in 356 BCE and died in 323 BCE, 32 years old, in Babylon, of causes that have never been fully agreed upon. In between, he conquered Persia and Egypt and Central Asia and pushed into India further than any Greek force had gone before or would go again. He carried with him a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, who had been his teacher, and he is said to have slept with it under his pillow. He modeled himself on Achilles. He wept at Achilles' tomb. He was trying to be the hero he had read about, and whether or not he succeeded in becoming that hero he certainly succeeded in becoming something. The legacy of Alexander is what the Greeks called something, and what we now struggle to name without either romanticizing or condemning it. A Greek-speaking world stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus, in which Greek culture and language and thought became the medium through which much of the educated world operated. The Hellenistic age that followed Alexander's death and the fracture of his empire into the kingdoms of his generals was an age of tremendous creative synthesis. Greek philosophy meeting Egyptian religion, meeting Babylonian astronomy, meeting Persian statecraft. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest concentration of recorded knowledge in the ancient world, was built in this atmosphere. And then Rome came. And this is where the myth of Greek collapse and Roman inheritance becomes both true and insufficient, because the Romans were so thoroughly educated by Greek culture that calling them the destroyers of it is only part of the story. They were its most enthusiastic consumers and preservers. The educated Roman was a bilingual Greek-Latin mind. The myths that Romans told were Greek myths rehoused. The gods were renamed and given Roman costumes, but the stories underneath were the same stories. Virgil's Aeneid is Homer with a Roman visa and a Roman destination. The physical city of Athens fell to Sulla in 86 BCE, sacked badly, some of its famous architectural treasures looted or destroyed. This is what imperial power does to the things it claims to admire. It takes them for itself and calls the taking admiration. And yet, the philosophy survived. The schools of Athens kept teaching into the era of the Roman Empire and beyond it, until the Emperor Justinian closed them in 529 CE, a date that is often given as the official end of ancient philosophy, though philosophy, being what it is, did not actually end. It went underground and moved east and eventually came back. There is a kind of historical vertigo in tracing the journey of Greek thought from its origins in the 8th century BCE, through its Hellenistic diffusion, through its Roman absorption, through its Byzantine preservation, through its Islamic transmission, through its medieval European reception, through its Renaissance rediscovery, through its role in the Enlightenment, through the formation of modern political philosophy and modern science. The line is interrupted constantly and is also somehow continuous. The river goes underground and emerges in another place and is still the same river. The democracy Athens invented was not a clean idea. It was built on slavery, on the exclusion of women from political life, on a distinction between citizen and non-citizen that was as brutal as any caste system. The philosophy it produced grappled with these contradictions to varying degrees of seriousness. Plato built an ideal state that would have been a totalitarian nightmare. Aristotle called slavery natural, which says something about the limits of even the most sophisticated ancient intelligence. Socrates, who was the most dangerous kind of person, the kind who keeps asking questions until the questions become threatening, was executed for it. And yet, the questions they asked are still the questions. What is justice? What does a good life look like? What do we owe each other? How should power be organized? What is the relationship between individual excellence and collective good? What do we do about death? What is the nature of beauty and truth, and are they the same thing? These are not Greek questions. These are human questions that Greeks were the first to write down in ways that survived, which is a different thing and an important one. The survival was contingent. The library burned, probably multiple times, by multiple agents, in multiple fires, over multiple centuries, rather than in a single dramatic conflagration. Much was lost. What we have is what the chain of transmission managed to carry, and the chain broke repeatedly and was repaired by different hands in different centuries. Something that strikes me, and I am aware this is a slightly anachronistic way of noticing it, which is exactly why I'm noting it and then backing away from it, is how often the Greek myths seem to know things that the Greek philosophers were still trying to work out. The myths understood, long before the philosophers arrived, that power corrupts in structural rather than personal ways, that the son of the tyrant becomes the tyrant by trying to avoid becoming the tyrant, that the most heroic figure is never the one who avoids suffering, but the one who transforms it into something that outlasts them, that fate is not external to the self, but is in some sense constituted by the self, by the shape of one's character meeting the shape of one's circumstances. The tragic poets, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, built their careers on the gap between what the myths seemed to promise and what they actually delivered. Sophocles wrote Oedipus knowing that every member of his audience knew how it would end, and the play was not about the ending, but about the quality of the attention paid on the way there. Euripides wrote Medea and gave us a woman who killed her children and asked us to understand, if not excuse, and the play has never stopped disturbing audiences because Euripides refused to make it simple. The dark legacy the prompt asks me to address is not the violence of the myths, or the cruelty of the gods, or the suffering of the heroes, though all of those are real. The dark legacy is the thing the Greek world bequeathed that it did not intend to bequeath. The idea of civilization as the property of those who can claim descent from it. The idea that Greek thought is the origin of all real thought. The idea that the particular form of political organization and philosophical inquiry that emerged on this rocky, poor, quarreling peninsula is the template against which all other forms should be measured. This idea did enormous harm. It was used to justify empire, to dismiss the intellectual traditions of cultures that didn't happen to write in Greek or produce texts that survived in the relevant libraries, to construct a hierarchy of civilizations with the Greek at the top that most of the people who built that hierarchy would not have recognized as Greek in any meaningful way. The Greeks themselves were not Western Europeans. They were Mediterranean people. They borrowed from Egypt and Mesopotamia and Phoenicia and Persia, and they knew they had borrowed, and for the most part said so. The story of Greece as the pure origin of Western civilization is a story that was made up mostly in the 18th and 19th centuries by people who needed a usable past. What the Greek myths actually say, if you read them without that ideological overlay, is something more honest and more useful. That every order is eventually overthrown by the next one. That every claim to permanence is a form of hubris. That the cosmos does not have a preferred civilization. That the gods whatever they are, play games that human beings do not fully understand and cannot fully control. This is not a comfortable message. It is also, perhaps, a necessary one. The katabasis, the descent to the underworld and the return, is the oldest story in the world, older than Greece, present in Mesopotamian epic and Egyptian ritual and shamanic practice across cultures that had no contact with each other. The Greeks made it their own and put it in the mouths of their heroes. Odysseus, descending to speak with the dead. Orpheus, going after Eurydice. Heracles, dragging Cerberus back. Aeneas, guided by his father's shade through the territories of the dead. What they all come back with is not treasure but knowledge. The dead know what the living cannot see. The underworld is not punishment for most of those who go there and return, but perspective. The hero who descends and returns comes back different. They have seen the shape of things from underneath. There is a version of this that is simply theological. There is a world of the dead. Its geography and population are described. There are rules for navigating it. There is another version that is psychological. The descent is what happens when the self confronts its own mortality directly, when it goes all the way down to the place where personal identity becomes permeable and fragile, and the return is the integration of what was confronted there. The Greeks held both versions simultaneously. They were not particularly troubled by the contradiction. Orpheus is the figure who failed the katabasis, who descended and retrieved Eurydice and then looked back. Ovid's rendering of this has been the most influential, and the detail is always the same. He looked back. The prohibition was clear. He looked back anyway. Why? The versions offer different explanations. Love, doubt, fear that she was no longer there. But the most interesting reading is that he could not complete the transformation that the descent demands. To bring Eurydice back, he had to become someone capable of not looking back. He was not that person. The god, or fate, or the nature of loss itself knew that before he did. The memory of Greece is the memory of a civilization that kept looking back. The philosophers looked back to an archaic golden age. The Alexandrian scholars looked back to a classical past. The Romans looked back to the Greeks. The Renaissance looked back to Rome and Greece. Every generation of Western modernity has organized itself in some relationship to this origin, whether that relationship is reverence or critique or ambivalent inheritance. What is strange, and what I keep coming back to, is that the Greeks themselves did not seem particularly interested in being the origin of anything. They were interested in the questions. They were interested in the problems. The pre-Socratics were trying to figure out what the world is made of. Plato was trying to figure out what we can know. Aristotle was trying to classify everything that existed, which is a project so enormous that even Aristotle couldn't finish it. The tragedians were trying to figure out how to live in a world where suffering is not distributed according to merit. These were urgent questions. They were not trying to produce a heritage. They were trying to survive intellectually in a cosmos that did not explain itself. The fact that their attempts to survive intellectually became the foundation of what later ages called Western civilization is a historical accident with enormous consequences. Some of those consequences were beautiful, some were not. Cradle, fate, is the concept at the center of everything in the Greek world, and it is the concept most misunderstood in translation. The Greeks had multiple words for it. Moira, the portion allotted; haimarmene, the connected chain of causation; taich, luck or fortune, the random surface over the determined depth; ananke, necessity, the absolute inescapability that even the gods must bow to. These are not the same concept. They describe different aspects of the same phenomenon, which is the way in which human freedom and cosmic determinism coexist in any single life. The Greek resolution of the free will problem, which the philosophers would debate explicitly, but which the myths had already worked out implicitly, is roughly this: the limits are set, but what you do within the limits defines you. Oedipus was fated to kill his father and marry his mother. He could not avoid the fact of these events. What he was not fated to do was to rip out his own eyes in self-punishment when he discovered what he had done. That was his. That came from who he was. The gods set the stage. The character determines the action. This is uncomfortable because it refuses the easy consolations. It refuses both "it was all fate, nothing was your fault," and "you are fully responsible, fate is an excuse." It says both things simultaneously. The play, the life, happens at the intersection. Death, in the Greek world, is the one certainty that all of this mythology circles without fully solving. The Olympians did not die. The heroes died, spectacularly, memorably, at appointed or unappointable times. Ordinary humans died too. The underworld received everyone eventually. Even the gods, it was hinted, might pass if the cosmos passed, which is why the myths imagine things older than the gods: chaos, Gaia, the fates themselves, who spin and cut the thread of life for every being, including divine ones, though the thread for a god is very long. The Greek response to death was not primarily religious in the sense we might use that word. It was not primarily about what comes after. It was primarily aesthetic. You die either memorably or forgettably. The worst fate is not suffering, but oblivion. Not pain, but the erasure of your name from the record. Achilles chose death and glory over life and forgetting. This is not about an afterlife. It is about the attention the living pay to the memory of the dead. Kleos, glory, the thing you leave behind, is the nearest the Greeks come to immortality, and it is a specifically human kind, not granted by the gods, but created by the quality of your actions and maintained by the willingness of future generations to remember them. The poets were therefore not entertainers in our sense. They were memory keepers. They were the technology by which the dead remained present. Homer was not a poet who happened to write about heroes. Homer was the mechanism by which Achilles continued to exist, and Homer knew this, and Achilles, in some sense, knew it too. The dark side of Kleos is that the memory requires a story, and stories simplify. What we remember of the heroes is not them, their fears, their tedium, their bad days, the moments when they were petty or confused or wrong. What we remember is the condensed, shaped, aesthetically managed version, the myth. The myth is always cleaner than the life, and so the civilization that invented the individual, that made personal excellence and personal tragedy the engine of its cultural imagination, was simultaneously building a machine for replacing individuals with their own archetypes. The physical legacy of Greece is everywhere in the architecture that modernity considers authoritative: columns, proportions, the geometry of democracy. The intellectual legacy is in every philosophical tradition that followed: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Neoplatonism, Christian theology as filtered through Greek categories, the Enlightenment as a rereading of the classical texts through new eyes. The literary legacy is in every hero story ever told, every villain who believes they are the hero, every tragic figure destroyed by the precision of their own excellence. The mythological legacy is stranger and harder to locate because it is not in a single tradition, but in the structure of imagination itself. The descent and return, the hubris and nemesis, the hidden divine child, the trickster, the inescapable prophecy. These patterns do not belong to Greece. They were old when Greece was young. Greece shaped them and named them and gave them the particular form that survived into the European tradition, which then spread its particular form of them everywhere its power reached. But they were already there, in other names and other landscapes, the same deep grammar of human experience, writing itself in local dialects. The Greek Empire, properly speaking, lasted a very short time. Alexander built it, and it fell apart when he died. What lasted was the culture that preceded and outlasted the empire, the culture of the polis, the city-state, the argument, the question. That culture was never unified politically. It never produced a single emperor with unchallenged rule over a Greek-speaking world. What it produced instead was a mode of thought, a way of organizing inquiry, a set of stories and aesthetic principles and political experiments that proved extraordinarily transmissible across cultures and centuries. Whether this transmissibility was a feature or a bug depends on what it transmitted and to whom. The ideas of Greek democracy inspired genuine movements for human freedom and were simultaneously used to justify the enslavement of people deemed insufficiently Greek or insufficiently rational. The philosophical tradition produced Socrates and also produced the philosophical justifications for Platonist tyranny. The aesthetic tradition produced the Parthenon and also produced the aesthetic ideology that has been used for 2 millennia to construct a hierarchy of beauty in which the Greek model sits at the top. The myths tell you this will happen. They have always told you this. Every order that imagines itself permanent is Kronos, swallowing his children. Every civilization that defines itself as the highest form of civilization is Ouranos, pushing the monsters back into the earth. The cosmos, in the Greek view, is not teleological. It is cyclical. There is no final victory, no ultimate resolution, no age after which the decline ceases. There is only the next generation, and the choice it makes about what to remember and what to let go, and what to transform into something that can survive the conditions of its own particular present. The thread does not break, it is cut by the fates, and a new thread is spun, and the spinning is continuous. Hesiod ends his account of the ages of man in the age of iron, our age, with a vision that has not dated. Men will grow more divided, friends will betray friends, children will dishonor parents, the fates will not value the oath, eidos and nemesis, shame and righteous anger, will leave the world of humans and go back to the gods, leaving only suffering behind. He wrote this in the 8th century BCE. The Parthenon had not been built. Athens had not invented democracy. The tragedies had not been written. The philosophers had not asked their questions. All of that was ahead, in an age that Hesiod could not see. He was sitting in the worst of times, describing the worst of times, and what he produced was not despair but something more complicated, a record that acknowledged the darkness and continued anyway. The myths, in the end, are not stories about the gods, they are stories about the darkness and the choice to continue. Prometheus did not give fire to humanity because he was certain it would help them. He gave it because it was wrong for them to be cold. Achilles did not go to Troy because he was certain of glory. He went because the alternative, the long, safe, forgotten life, was intolerable to him. Odysseus did not keep sailing because he was certain he would reach home. He kept sailing because stopping meant dying in someone else's story. The darkness is there from the beginning. Chaos came first, and from it, everything else. The darkness is not the enemy of the light. It is the condition of the light. You cannot have the dawn without the night before it. Cannot have Hemera without Nyx. Cannot have the age of gold without the age that follows it. Cannot have the hero without the loss that forms them. The Greek world knew this. It built everything it built in that knowledge. It made beauty in the knowledge that the beauty would not last. It asked questions in the knowledge that the answers would be partial and provisional. It told stories in the knowledge that the stories would be changed by every telling, and then it ended. Not cleanly, not completely, but in the way that civilizations end, which is by gradual absorption into the next thing, by losing the edges that had defined it, by becoming the substrate on which the next growth occurs. The myths did not end with Greece. They moved, as myths do, finding new hosts, new languages, new needs they could answer. They are still moving. They will still be moving after we are gone. The hero with 1,000 faces, Joseph Campbell's phrase for the pattern that Odysseus and Heracles and Perseus and Achilles all inhabit, is not Greek, because Greece is not where it comes from and is not where it stops. It is the shape human consciousness makes when it tries to understand the relationship between individual life and the vast, indifferent, sometimes beautiful, often terrifying cosmos in which it finds itself. This has been going on for as long as humans have been telling stories. Greece did not invent it. Greece just did it, at a particular moment, with a particular intensity, in a way that the record happened to preserve, and the record once preserved, became something that every subsequent age had to reckon with. That reckoning continues. You are part of it, wherever you are listening from. The myths survive because something in them is alive, because the questions they ask are still the questions, because the darkness they sit in is still the darkness. But perhaps that is enough for tonight. Perhaps the thread, for now, should rest. The gods are watching from their high places, if they are watching at all. The heroes are where heroes go. The stories are in the air, in the walls, in the grain of thought. Sleep well, wherever you are. We will do this again. Good night.